So the podium is here.
Thank you.
I mean, you can introduce yourself, but
Yeah.
what you're doing much better than I can. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here again, actually. It's not just a burden, it's also a great pleasure. Yeah, my name is Anja Bierwirth. I started as a carpenter, then I became an architect, and now I'm working in environmental and climate sciences with a focus on climate policy, mainly in cities, actually. And the Wuppertal Institute, as Professor Lang just said, they started very early, pretty much right from the beginning in the 90s when they were founded, to think about sustainability and sustainable development not only in a technological way, where you could sum up all the areas of renewables and efficiency measures, but also in the questioning what societal, what cultural change do we need concerning our lifestyles and the wealth and our understanding of what is well-being. So that's we have definitely a pretty long history in talking about sufficiency, but not so much in this area of really sufficiency policy making. So that popped up like maybe 7-8 years ago, seeing that it is not just an individual choice if you want to live sufficiently, meaning using less. It is not just about telling someone, well, just leave your car and ride your bike, because if the infrastructure is just made for cars, it's very difficult to ride the bike sometimes. So this is actually the point where it comes to policy making, and this is something that I'm personally quite interested in. So main quarter is Wuppertal, and we also have a small Berlin office to have the connection to the German federal policy making area. We have pretty much 230 people working there, out of them 130 scientists. And as you can see, we have people from very different disciplines working in our institute. And this is, it's not just by chance who is coming, but the idea behind sustainable development is a very broad one. And it really needs knowledge from very different disciplines and very different understandings coming together and thinking together to come up with solutions that are not only technological feasible, economic feasible, but also social adequate and for society to be implemented. So this is a brief quotation out of our mission statement. And as you can say, we are looking for model strategies and instruments for transitions to sustainable development. So it is not only about saying, so where are the problems and what is the sustainable future, but for us the main question is how to get there. What is the first step? What is the next step? Which steps do we need to go? And this is pretty much the core of our work. We have people working on international level in climate policy. We have people working on EU level, and working very much on local level with municipalities. We have people working on climate and energy systems. We have people working on resources. So it's quite a broad mixture of subjects we are looking at. And for us, it is, as I said, it is. The one question is which technological change do we need and how can we implement it, but also how can we decouple economic growth and wealth from the natural resources. And the one decoupling that happens already is that from the resources we have, we get more and more out, whether it's energy, material, or whatever. But the question, how much energy and material do we need at all to fulfill an adequate and a decent life? That's a main question that we work on when we talk about the sufficiency subject. So why is sufficiency necessary at all, and why are buildings so important? And I want to bore you with too many numbers, but I brought some of them because I find them quite interesting. So buildings in Germany are still the users of more than, of pretty much 40% of the overall energy used in Germany, 40%, which is 1/3 of CO2 emissions. We have, interestingly, though we have the NF in Germany and now the GEG, the new energy saving law, there is hardly any energy savings in the building sector since 2010. And also from the building sector, this is now not only buildings but also streets and parking spaces, etc., everything that is built, industry. We have pretty much more than half of waste production comes from the building sector. I mean, quite a lot of these resources can be, or this waste can be used again. But generally, it's not really like a high quality primary use. You can use it for, but it's more used for, let's say, the ground for street building, etc. So this is really buildings, and building per se, not only buildings but also streets, etc., is really a really important aspect when you look at where do we want to go to, and what is sustainable development. Some more numbers. Looking at the resources. 570 million tons of mineral resources, 5.5 million tons of steel, 26 million tons of cement every year built in Germany. The resources used, and I think in the last year it looks like it's this year it might even go up again a little bit. More than 60 hectares of land use for new buildings, for new settlements. And as you might know, we have some goals in Germany regarding sustainable development. We have climate protection goals, but we also have land use goals. In 2050, we are supposed to have a 60% renewables energy share of all energy we use in Germany. And this does include industries, really high energy intensive industries, which is maybe the most difficult sector to integrate the renewables, because they have these very special and very high energy needs. But we also have the goal of an almost climate neutral building stock. And apart from that, it is not really clear what is an almost neutral building, climate neutral building, regarding what kind of efficiency, what kind of renewables. It just says it should use almost no energy, and this little energy left that is needed, that should come from renewables. But I don't know if you had it in your mind, and if you had to have a chance to look at this new legislation just came up in Germany. Pretty much all scientists say the efficiency that is now demanding in this law, and is exactly the same as it was in the law before, is not enough to reach these goals. Another goal we have, actually for 2020, for next year, is 30 hectares of land use for new settlements. While we are talking, and also in media and press, the climate goals that we obviously will not reach for Germany were quite popular, that's actually a target that no one talks about. So you won't hardly find anything in press or in media about this. Although the climate targets will be maybe missed by, I'm not sure yet exactly, maybe 5 to 8%, and the land use target we will just miss by more than 200%. But nevertheless, it is just not so popular. Sorry?
Yeah. And you just have to realize that it's actually per day, you know.
Per day?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. It is per day. Sorry. Yeah. This is not per year. This is not 2050. This is 2020. Okay, so 2020 per day. Yeah. Yeah. So we are far apart from reaching that target. So, but where does it come from now? I said since 2010 there is hardly any absolute energy use reduction in the building sector. But why is that? So there are a couple of reasons, but what you can see here with this pink line, this is the energy demand per square meter. This means, as you can see, as it is lowering, this is the efficiency we have in the building sector. So it really helps, definitely. Efficiency measures in buildings are very good for lowering the energy demand per square meter. But what happens in Germany at the same time is that the living space per person is going up for decades. And every scenario we have so far in Germany, can you see it?
Mm. Yeah.
So, okay, this is 1960.
Okay, thank you.
We are now here, so this is actually, it was 2015 when it was new, so we are almost 2020, and it's a scenario going further to 2050. Okay, so this is 1960, 2050, and we are somewhere here in this area now. And this is what happened so far. This is what scenarios assume what will happen, and with this line, the same, the living space per capita. So we are at 46, 47 square meter per person right now, and it's supposed, or pretty much all scenarios we have so far, there's just came out one new one that I didn't have a chance to look at, that might change this assumption a little bit, but pretty much every scenario assumes that living space per person will go up further over the next decades. Interesting, these scenarios are not made by the building industry, but they are made by these are energy and climate scenarios, which I always found pretty interesting because they just assume this will go up and nobody asks why. So what this has finally as effect is that the energy demand, the energy use per person is hardly lowering. And this is exactly why we have this effect that with all the efficiency we have, the efficiency programs we have in buildings, is just eaten up by the living space per person increasing. I just made a little, yeah, I don't know. I took two years, not really far from each other, 2002, 2016. And I chose these 2 years because we had, statistically seen, exactly the same amount of inhabitants in Germany. 82.5 million people living in Germany. 2002, we had close to 39 million flats, houses, well, flats, let's say living units in buildings. In 2016, we had close to 42 million living units. Interesting is that 2002, when Chancellor Schröder was then, he said Germany is built. And it was fine, because there was no need and no big problem in the building sector, in the housing sector. It was fine. Everybody was kind of okay with living. Interestingly, we have a couple of millions more living units, but obviously we have a need of 400,000 living units per year, being built per year in Germany now. So this is, I find it quite interesting to see that. And of course you can say and you can see that the buildings we have and the living units we have are not necessarily there where the people want to live. But nevertheless, the question, I think, has to be raised, what are we doing with the buildings we have? And is this really what we need, the 400,000 units per year? So, what happens in Germany, why this is, why do we have this increase in living space per person? There are a couple of reasons, these are just some of them. One thing is that over the last decades, each built unit, each new flat is bigger than the one that was built before. Let's say the 3-room unit today is bigger than a 3-room unit that was built in the 60s or 70s or 80s. Then another thing we have in Germany, and not, as far as I know, not yet any change in this trend, we have more single households or two-person households. So that the size of households is shrinking. And as you can imagine, as a single person, having, let's say, a small apartment, you have your own kitchen, you have your own 1 or 2 rooms, let's say living room and a bedroom, and you have your own bathroom, and maybe you have a little corridor. And just in case you would have a household of 3 persons sharing a kitchen, sharing the corridor, sharing the bathroom, and it becomes quite clear that the bigger a household is, usually the smaller the square meter you use per person is, because you share more of the space you have. Another point is we have, I just skipped the second one, I see. We have a trend still for more single-family buildings instead of multi-family buildings. And it can be seen that single-family houses always have more space than flats with the same number of rooms in multi-family houses. We have more owners in Germany. It's a small increase, but it is an increase that we have more people owning a building, owning a flat. And you can see if you rent a flat, you're not necessarily looking for the most square meters, but if you buy something, you look for something bigger. So if you're looking for a 3-room flat, you generally choose a bigger flat instead of what you rented before. Then we have 3 points that are having something to do with age. So the one thing is the age and effect. This is quite clear. I don't know how you guys are living right now, but I'd say you're somewhere in this area, 18 to 25. Someone older? Someone younger?
20 years.
Okay, so you're in this group already, but nevertheless. So I mean, it's clear, and it's not really surprising because you start working, the first money coming in is maybe not that much. So, and the further you evolve over your working days, you know, you have better income, you can afford more. Maybe you found a family, you want to have children. So you know, you go from one stage to the other, and it's growing over the years, generally, the flat you have. So let's say here there might be 2 children already living with you. But what happens now, and that is this empty nest effect, when your children move out again, this is something that we see in the households that are in this area at the moment. You not necessarily choose to reduce your number of rooms or reduce your size of your flat, or you move to a smaller flat. That's something that happens very rarely. So people, couples, I don't know how your parents live since you moved out. Anyone has parents who moved now to a smaller flat? Oh, 1, 2, 3. Oh, at least.
Can we have interviews for our?
Yeah. No, but still, you can see, you know, it's still quite rare. And so what happens is that you do not reduce your flat anymore. And let's say you have 2 children. You were 4 persons living on 100 square meters. You had 25 square meters per person. 2 children moving out. Suddenly you have 50 square meters per person. So, and that's actually what these numbers say. And then we have another thing called the cohort effect. Though someone said just recently, which I like even better, it's the effect of the of wealth. It's the income effect, because we earn more than people just a couple of years ago, and though living also becomes more expensive, we can afford more for living at the moment. And this is what the cohort effect says, because we can afford more, and this here is not necessary that the 80s plus people today in Germany lived on 100 square meters before, but they never lived bigger. So it can very well be that these people here just take their 100 square meters with them throughout the next years. So this is something that increases and triggers the rising square meters also. A question?
Yes, because of the household changing.
Yeah.
For example, in Munich, maybe why should a couple change their flat? Because I think if you have a flat, it's sometimes cheaper to stay in the big flat than buying a new one. So.
Absolutely. And this is exactly one of the barriers we have here. Yeah. There are quite some barriers. I mean, this is just to start with, where does it come from at all? And then if you want to start changing it and you want to develop policies for a change regarding the increase of space per person, then you of course the next step is then what are the barriers? So why don't people do it at all? I mean, if they would be just rational people, they could say, I move to a smaller flat, it's cheaper, so I can save money. But that's exactly not what is happening, because that's one of the barriers we have. That the smaller flats very often are even more expensive than a bigger flat that you've rented for 30 years already. Yeah. But nevertheless, I mean, I just wanted to focus a little bit on the question: why is it happening? What are the drivers behind it? And this is not even all, and I'm sure there might be some more. Not exactly knowing which reason has which share in triggering the increase, but to understand what is happening helps as a first glimpse to think about where could I go into with policy making. And of course this increase has a couple of effects, and we had the daily land use for settlements just a minute ago. Each new building needs energy and resources. Even if you go the most efficient way, you can go to plus energy buildings, but the building of a building at first glance needs energy and needs resources. And it needs energy while you're living in it. So the most efficient building actually is only a contribution to sustainable development if it is used efficiently also. Or you could say if it's used sufficiently. Environmental effect we have here also is that the new built areas have an impact on the climate change adaptation. So I don't know how much you were into adaptation measures already, but of course we have the need for greening cities, for cooling heat islands in cities. We have the need to also to lower the not only CO2 emissions but all other emissions also. So and the more dense and the more cement, concrete, and all these resources you have, the more heat you have in the cities. This is why. What was it? I think in Cologne, that's something I remember, in a really hot summer day in the inner city of Cologne, you are 8 degrees over the temperature, just let's say at the edge of Cologne. So, and 8 degrees is really a difference, especially when it comes to elderly people or sick people, children. So that's something that we have to work on when it comes to sustainable development also. So all these new needs for buildings also have a climate adaptation impact. The social effects, I mean, the housing shortage, it is reality. It is, you know, though we have millions of more units, living units in houses in Germany already compared to 2002, but nevertheless, there is a housing shortage. But on the other hand, when you look at the distribution of space and people, you also see social effects. When it comes to elderly people, there is quite a group that we do not know too much about yet, but who are saying, I'd like to move, because my flat is too big, but I just don't find anything, or it's too much of a burden to move. I don't know where to move. I'd like to stay in my neighborhood, but I don't know what, I don't want to move far. You know, all these different aspects have to do a lot with it. But nevertheless, we have quite a group where this wealth of having a nice and big flat or a nice big house once becomes a burden. When you cannot really, when you just become too physically too weak to really do your household, or you know, all the modernization stuff or whatever you have to do, and it just becomes too much for you. So that's actually a group of, let's say, 20% of people over 65 living on more than 100 square meters. This is pretty much a group we know a little bit about. Another point is housing for elderly people. It is always seen, either you stay in your flat or you go to elderly people's home. But there's a broad range between that. And the problem with people, especially in the city centers where the housing shortage appears most, is that they end up finally as one person in a too big flat. And not necessarily these buildings are barrier-free, so all this area, this part of social inclusion or exclusion for elderly people is quite a problem in some of these areas. So this is pretty much the starting point where we started when we are looking at sufficiency in buildings. A second step we did was thinking about what could support sufficiency in buildings. And we came to different aspects. Building design meaning planning new. Building use is what can we do with what we have. Because still, although we have a building shortage, but the sentence from Chancellor Schröder, Germany is built, still is valid. Because we are not building as much new as we have to work on what we have on the building stock. So we have a couple of things. Can you read it out there? Or is it just more? Okay? Yeah, okay. Okay, the one thing we see is a trend, I guess you heard about it, the tiny house movement, micro apartments, flats, etc. So living really small, reducing all your stuff and living on very, very small space. Another point we see is building flexible, so having ground floor plans that are made for growing and shrinking. I'll come to that later. We also have the concept of inner development. So if you do not have enough area for you, maybe you can use the height in your room or in your flat. Also multifunctional planning. So how flexible is the use plan for a room, which can make a lot of impact when it comes to who can use this room and for what. And then also shared buildings is something that we can see. We have of course, I mentioned elderly people's home. These are finally also come in this area, but students' homes also, residential home for specific groups, for special rooms, but also sharing areas or rooms with other families, not just your core family, but with other families. So also that is something that you can think of. When it comes to existing buildings, we have, this is not so much the housing area, but also it can has an impact on you. How do you want to live? So if the trend goes on like it is, you know, that home office becomes more and more popular, which we see. it has something with organization. So it might be that you use some more space in your private flat, but it might be that for that an office building is saved. We also have virtual rooms, like when you come together for telephone conference or video conferences, etc. So rooms that do not need to be built. Also in existing buildings, we have the question of how flexible is a building, how flexible is a flat to be used. We have the multiple uses, and that actually can be in different ways. Either you have multiple uses in the way you use. Do you have like living in kitchen? You can have a bedroom with a working space. You can have what else? A living room that is also a guest room. You have like different various uses over each other. Also the question of reuse and change of use is in the building sector very, very relevant, and especially when it comes to the housing shortage. Because you can go through Munich inner city, you can go through Frankfurt, you can go through Cologne city, Berlin city, and you see empty buildings. You see empty offices, you see buildings that are used only temporarily, schools for example, and all these buildings offer room that might be used differently over time or from different people at one time. So that is something that you can think about too. And then of course also similar as for the building design and the new build buildings, you can have shared areas and room and even shared furniture. And not only furniture, but all kinds of stuff you have in your flat. Some example, I talked about the tiny houses and the micro apartments, so just two pictures that illustrate how they could look like. Another colleague of Arne's, actually, Gerd Streng, he designed some ideas for families whose flats became too small, but they didn't want to move. So he designed all kinds of very, very small stairs or elements being built in a room to use not only the floor area, but also the height of the rooms. Quite interesting things. I mean, this is, I always like this picture very much because it's not so clear, but this is the kitchen. And I was always wondering how I would make it to walk over my kitchen, because in my kitchen it doesn't look like. But nevertheless, I mean, if you need to walk, maybe you just clean. An example that Arne designed, actually, here, Arne Steffen, I borrowed it from him, Mobi Space. This is not, so far not made for living, Arne, right? Or did you do it for living also? Yes.
Not yet.
Not yet, yeah. But for offices and schools, yeah. But it could work for living also.
Yeah.
So, you have like containers, just not regular containers, but designed very nicely and actually with a high efficiency even, right, Anna?
Yes.
And as you can see, made on the outer, so the resources play a big role here too, because they're made from wood. And as you can see, you can put them together like Lego stones, and if you don't need them anymore, you just can take them away again. Another possibility is flexible use. This is in the Netherlands, I think, or maybe it was Belgium, I can't remember. Okay, thank you. So it's an office over daytime, or I think it's an agency for public relations. And in the evenings, they just lift up the tables and they put away all the, you see everything what is here is rolling. You can just roll it away. And then in the evenings, they have yoga workshops, they have DJs doing parties, etc. So you have not this empty space in your city when the office is closed. Flexible use also, I was talking about furniture. So, most simple example, your kitchen table might also be your working space. This is my kitchen table actually, and I do not have a working space, although I do quite a lot of home office. But for me it's totally fine to sit in the kitchen and do my work there. So, and you can, if you come from, if you really plan new, you can think about these multiple flexible uses right from the beginning. And you can think about what uses can I share, what do I need? I mean, maybe not everybody wants to share a bedroom with another person, but I think it's quite easy to share, for example, so-called working space, I wrote, no, it shall say co-working space. So you can, of course, you can share a working space with other people. You can share washing and drying, which is actually in Switzerland is completely popular, that you do not have washing machines in your flat, but you just have them, you have a washing room in your house that everybody uses. Children's playing room, for example, if you live together with other families, not every child necessarily needs a huge room with all the play and the toys inside it. So that's something that you can think about too. So these are just some examples of areas you can share and uses you can share that definitely help to reduce the need for floor space. I'd like to come to an end with one example that I visited in Switzerland, I think last year or maybe 2 years ago, which is called Hunziker Areal. It's in Zurich. It was an industrial area, and this is built new, but at least the area before was used industrially, but the houses are built new. 13 houses for 13 houses for, what is it, 1,300 people, pretty much. This is how it looks like. Actually, it's really nice. It's an area that is not really popular in Zurich. So it's very. It used to be very industrial. Now they're pretty much only offices. But the city of Zurich, they want to get a little mixed use in this area. So they decided to come up with an experimental housing project. And in these buildings, you find all different kinds of housing concepts. So very regular, from single apartment to 3-room flats. But also you find what they call cluster housing. So you have like very, very tiny private areas organized around a bigger community living space. They also work with flexible rooms. So if you need, let's say you have a child and you need one more room, you can get another room that is just next to your flat, and if you do not need it anymore, but maybe your neighbor needs it, then you can change the use of these rooms. So you can shrink and grow with the number of rooms you have. In these houses, no one has a washing machine. Actually, there is no connection for washing machines in none of these flats, but they all have just common washing rooms. What they also have, what I like very much, is a mobility station, because for the 1,300 people living there, there are only 80 parking spaces. 80. 40 of them for the people who have the restaurants there and the bars, and I don't know, there are some other public and commercial users. So it is pretty much clear, if you want to move there, you cannot have a car because you do not have a parking space. The reason about this is, I mean, okay, we're talking about houses, but you'll see soon, once you're in your planning prophecy, you will see that parking in Germany still is a big issue. So you have to build parking spaces if you build a house. No matter if it's for housing or it's an office or whatever, you have to build parking spaces. And you have minimum levels, how many parking spaces you have to build if you build a house, concerning on the use and how many people are living there or working there. In Switzerland, it's just the other way around. They just change it. They do not have a minimum level anymore. They have a maximum level now. If you build a flat, you're allowed to build maximum 1 parking space. But you can leave it out. If you do not want to, let's say in Germany, if you do not have the space to build parking spaces, it's really expensive. So you really have to pay quite a fee to the city because you do not, because they use it to build parking spaces elsewhere. Some of them started to invest into public transport, but still it's really this whole parking space thing is quite an issue when it comes to buildings and housing. And I see I forgot to translate my slide. I'm sorry, but I'm going to translate for you anyway. So we have, what can we do now? We have some legal instruments that we can use. The living space moratorium is an idea a colleague of mine came up with, because he said it does not make any sense for cities that either lose inhabitants, which we have in Germany also, or which are pretty much stable, what the number of inhabitants is. So why should they build new if there is enough space already? So he suggested that only cities that are really have an increase in inhabitants are allowed to build new and on new land. Then I mentioned the Gebäudeenergiegesetz, the new efficiency and energy supply law for Germany, for building in Germany, and there are quite some options where you could link sufficiency into the efficiency regulation we have there, but it's just not happening so far. This is the parking place law regulation that I just mentioned. But we also had, and now I come back to this point, what if the smaller flat I'd like to move to is even more expensive than the flat I'm coming from. There are instruments that are called Mietpreismitnahme, so you take your rent, your existing rent with you to the new flat. Another option is you do not have a new rental contract, but you just take over and you just switch with another household. So you take over the rent that this household actually has. So there are two options. Either you have your own rent that you can take with you to the small flat, and the leftover flat can be rented on newly, or you just change with another household. And both is not a new let flat. And new let flats are actually the ones with the highest increase in rental prices. Then we have the KfW bank. I don't know if anyone of you knows the KfW bank. Well, whatever. It's a bank for Germany that has a broad range of support programs, financial support programs. And they give you loans or credits for energy efficiency measures in your buildings, or for renewable use in energy supply, or for if you come into ages and you want to reduce barriers in your flats. So all that is kind of stuff where you can ask for loans at the KfW. And they could also support living on smaller flats, which they actually just added, at least for the elderly people's living, just this summer. but that's something that they definitely could support more. And then, of course, we have some things that we right now want to try in a project. Anna and I are doing together just some of these things. What can a city, what can a municipality do to better provide the living space they have to address this lowering your personal square meter? So we have quite some options we can work on, but we have very little experiences so far. What is really working and what not. So there's quite some work to do. But the space. I talked a lot about space so far, but in the end, our concept of sufficiency in buildings is a bit broader. So in my last slide, I'd like to go into some more areas that are important too. We came up with a suggestion, where do we start with sufficiency in buildings? And the one is the space that we just had. And I'm not only talking about the floor area, but also the height. So the volume of a building, of the flat. Also, the construction and the design is interesting to look at. This is when it comes to resources. Because you can think about designing and constructing a building that you can deconstruct after a while or repair after a while. Much more easy and separating different materials from each other again. Or you can construct and design buildings that you can't. So whatever is adhesive, whatever you glue somewhere, it's actually a problem to separate it afterwards again. One example, I mean, if you have windows, you can choose, which is pretty much mostly done, is the, what is it called, PU foam, which is pretty much always used, I'd say. But of course, you can also decide to screw windows, and it might be it's much easier to change windows afterwards, and you have the pure wooden or the pure plastic frame in the end, and you can reuse this material or recycle this material much more easy. Then the question of equipment is, of course, a quite important thing when it comes to resources, but also to electricity use. How much equipment do I need? What do I really need in my flat? What can I share? What kind of equipment do I have in my room? I don't know how you live, but I know families with at least 3 TVs. Because not only the parents have a TV, but the 2 daughters in their rooms also. So that's a little bit of a question. Is it necessary? Is this just adequate, or is it over the top already? And also the question of use of rooms and space, the use of equipment, heating and airing practices, all that comes in the area of sufficiency. And talking about design and how flexible can the building be used, just one very simple example. If you have a walk-through room like this, it might be nice to use it either alone or maybe as a couple, but that's pretty much it. I don't know if you'd like to live together with one of your colleagues, your student colleagues, and decide who's living in this walk-through room. But having a corridor and that is really the access to all rooms makes it much easier and much more flexible for a building and for a flat to be used more flexible from different persons. So that just as a very brief impression, and that's actually something we are working on right now, which types of floor areas, which types of buildings offer what kind of sufficiency potential, and maybe next year we will be that far that we can come with some results of that together. So thank you very much. questions or remarks? Yes.
That was extremely interesting for me to listen, and I'm working in more or less the same idea right now. My question is with regard to one of your slides where you was saying about building design.
Mm-hmm.
There you mentioned like studio flats, tiny houses, etc. My point to that is, if you think about this in the long term, and for example you're living in it right now, you will probably not be able to have kids or make a new family there. And that's a big issue, maybe even for Germany right now, because you're as well experiencing depopulation. So how do you deal with that problem?
No, I absolutely agree. So this collection, starting with the tiny house and the micro apartments or studio flats, it is a collection of options how your area can be saved. The other question behind that is, for whom am I building it, and who is using it, and for how long? How much of it do I need? This is definitely not a concept that I'd say would be a sufficiency building concept for Germany. Absolutely not. But also there you can think about, you know, even if you have this like micro apartments and you have a couple of them, you could think about, can I design them as flexible that I could, you know, like switch rooms further on. So there are options of that, but I absolutely agree. Tiny houses and micro apartments are for a very specific group of persons. Yeah. Yeah.
For the example you said about Zurich or some similar projects, do you know how it works with the distribution of rent costs? I guess they're not only. So how does it work? Do they have flexible contracts, or?
In this case, it was a collaboration group, cooperative. Building cooperative who started it, and as well, if you have a building cooperative, you have to be a member to be allowed to rent a flat there. However, they have the target that they want to distribute the area they have. Well, no, other way around. They want to have a group of inhabitants that is pretty much the inhabitants of Zurich. So they want, regarding age, regarding income, regarding all kinds of aspects you social demographically usually have in your statistics. So if you have to buy your membership first and then pay rent, this is definitely something that not everybody can afford. So they came up with solutions for some of these flats. So they, apart from these from the cooperative, they founded some smaller groups that finally are the renters of this flat, and they sublet to people with less income, single rooms or single flats. So this is how they manage an interesting rental concept. But they definitely, well, they made pretty good in really offering space for pretty much everyone in Zurich. And this is what they monitor very well. So then they are monitoring the social demographic aspects of the inhabitants, energy use, resource use. So they have a huge monitoring instrument, because they want to see if they really make the sustainability goals they set themselves. Yeah. I mean, Zurich is extremely expensive. It's not comparable to Munich. So it's much more expensive than Munich rents this space. But for Zurich, it's quite cheap. Yeah.
Well, sustainability and special sufficiency is very hard to implement through politics. And you said that you are focusing a little bit more onto that aspect. as it is somehow very difficult to get politicians to focus a little bit more on it because it's long term and they are more focused on special situations. So what kind of ways do you have to implement more or to get these strategies implemented on a political basis?
Interesting question. Sometimes we don't know, we even don't know ourselves. Some things work, some things don't. No, but honestly, the thing with sufficiency so far is that it was always blamed on the individual person. So you can decide how you want to live. You can decide if you want to drive, if you want to have a car, how much you're driving, if you cycle, how much space do you need, what all kind of stuff do you buy. But our argumentation is that first of all, we have more than 80 million inhabitants in Germany. So if I would need to go to each single person and say, hey, look, why not leaving your car sometimes? Why not using sharing options here and there? That's quite some work. But if policy is implemented, it enables people to live more or to act more sustainable and more sufficiently. Meaning that if you reduce car use or parking spaces in inner cities, you just chase out individual motorized traffic from the cities. It is so, and you gain better quality for cycling or pedestrians. Same when it comes to housing. When you look at who is really looking for flats right now, where is the needs we have? Where are the needs in which groups in Germany? And on the other hand, you know that we have a problem with elderly people living in too big flats, being not able to leave them anymore on their own, which is quite a group. How could I help them? And you know, more from not just who is coming every day and taking care, but is there an option of having people living with them, or is there an option to bringing them from the 4th floor to the ground floor into a flat, you know, and all that could be reducing barrier and elderly adequate housing also, but this is something that is not really thought about so far. But there are organizations taking care of elderly people and giving advice for how to live and how to be able to live. And it's much more easy to inform them about this option. And they are the multipliers then, instead of going to each single person from door to door and trying to persuade. So policy making. But the question, of course, I mean, our projects, I'd say 90% of our projects always have political recommendations in it. And of course we have, I don't know, we have presentations, all kinds of formats and conferences, etc., that we try to do. We are publishing in briefs or papers and books, you know, popular books also, but pretty much as many as scientific books. So we try to organize kind of scientific results, PR also. But it's difficult, that absolutely. But we see a little bit of change right now in some of the ministries, actually, and the agencies. So this aspect of sufficiency is popping up here and there.
When you start thinking of a living concept, where do you start thinking of sufficiency? Like you talked about building small, building flexible, and so on. And I just thought that it's super difficult to have like all the social implications like bedded in, because I mean this also could backfire if you say I don't build any parking places, then and then there won't be people with cars. It could backfire if you don't have the infrastructure for people to get there and get away again. So where do you start? Where's the starting point from which you proceed? Is it like the people who should live there, or is it the people around the city, like the culture of living, where you start from?
I think it depends very much on what are we talking about. Do we have an area that is supposed to be developed newly? Is it a building that is there already that you have to do something with? Is it something where people live already, or is it a group of people who want to build together something? And so I think it's it's very individual. But I absolutely agree. If you do not, if you try to reduce individual mobility, you have to make sure that there is public transport. You cannot build it anywhere, just outside and then say be happy here and see how you come from A to B. Of course not. But that's I think that really depends very much. But if, let's say, you have a group of people, and they come to you and they ask you, I mean, Anna can say much more about that, but then you can ask them, so what do you expect from your building? What do you want? What do you need? And then you can try to match, for example, if there are, let's say there are families that want to somehow build together because they want all their children playing together, then you could think about something like, is there an option for a room where they can play? So the individual children rooms could be smaller. So, but that's definitely something that you have to think about when you know who asks you for what.
Maybe just to follow up, are there some like characteristics of those sufficiency measurements you talked about? Which you would say from your experience works pretty well, like those sharing washing machines, for example, or which of those like downsizing measurements are approved?
I find it interesting because in Switzerland, actually, it is not. I mean, that these flats in the Hunziker area do not have washing machines is not exceptional, because I think, as far as if I remember it right, 50% of all multifamily buildings do not have individual washing machines, but they just have a washing machine. So it's quite common in Switzerland. And but on the other hand, I heard people saying when I'm talking about it in Germany, I hear people saying, but I don't want my neighbor to know what underwear I'm wearing. So there's an individual problem with it, so they're ashamed of having their stuff hanging there and other people can see it. So it's definitely a cultural thing, and it's not like Switzerland being, I don't know, a developing country, but it's just a cultural thing, and I think it takes a while to get used to. But, well, I think one point is that this project, for example, that what they are also doing is monitoring the fluctuation. So how many people are moving in, moving out. What are they reporting about living quality? And it's extremely high. So they use less space because they gave themselves a space per person target. Over the whole project, not per person, each one is not allowed to, but over the whole project of 13 buildings it works. And the quality people are reporting is really high, it's very good. So I think if you have the infrastructure and you have projects that work, and you can just, then the next project is easier to implement. So then if you have like a little snowball effect of the projects, I think that's something that can work very well. To be honest, on the other hand, I'm really a fan of regulations. I don't believe in voluntary how do I call it? I don't want to use this. It's always so negative. You know, sufficiency is always connoted so negatively. You know, it's always that you want to take away from me. I have to leave this and that. But if you do it, if you let's say you sell your car and you're not driving around in the inner city for 20 minutes each evening to find a parking space, it's a quality gain, you know. And I think we are talking way too much about what do I have to leave behind and what is the lack, what am I lacking afterwards, instead of what quality do I gain from it. And all these sufficiency aspects, they have quality. It's not like that I want to chase anyone out of the flat.
Yeah, maybe it's connected to the last one. I mean, there's rational reasons why it makes sense, you know, but there's also this kind of emotional aspects where people go like, it might not make sense. So I guess the question is, first of all, do we have too much money floating around? No. And how do we be, and are you studying that at the Wuppertal Institute also, this kind of happiness relationship? And that's even linked to the regulation you just said, because if everybody has to sacrifice to some extent, you know, then it's a different story. So somebody was telling me, you know, I would be willing to subscribe to the idea of having a certain limitation if everybody is doing it. So if somebody is driving, let's say, the Porsche car or the SUV, you know, I want to be entitled to do it also. And even if I don't have money, I still try to get there, because it's my ultimate goal to be happy in life, in order to own a villa in Grünwald, you know, and to have an SUV and a Porsche car, this kind of lifestyle. And I look at magazines where I see this couch landscape, you know, and just for putting that couch landscape somewhere, you need 24 square meters for one person to sitting on a couch where you could live on a couch, basically. So how are you studying this kind of irrational, emotional element of this discussion of efficiency or not? You know, because I think that's probably a major game, you know, we are in there, you know, far more than can I afford it or not. Yeah. Do I feel important? Am I happy to be as rich, quote unquote, as my neighbor is? Are you analyzing that?
We are analyzing that too, and it's, I mean, this was very much about sufficiency in buildings, a little bit mobility. But in the end, when you discuss it further, you always come to capitalism, degrowth, post-growth discussions. So it's always the question, how could we live in different economic systems? And yes, your question is right, there is too much money floating around. And the problem is that we always need to reproduce and even get, you know, produce more money and more gain. And this is the main driver behind all this exaggeration we have. And I find it interesting. A colleague of mine, Michael Kropatz, he has a nice example, I think. If you're in a car crash and you're injured, it's very good for our growth, because the doctor has something to do, the ambulance has something to do, the hospital has something to do, and the auto industry has something to do, because you need a new car.
And the lawyers.
And the lawyers have something to do. So it's very good for wealth and for growth. If you decide to ride your bike and to repair it yourself, it's very bad for our growth, but it's very good for you. So what is the quality? But we are measuring our quality in general, overall, just by economic factors and indicators. And this is one of the main problems in Germany, I think. Because there is no, wealth in Germany is just measured in money, and not in the perceived quality of life. I mean, there are studies about it, but it not necessarily flows into policymaking. Yeah.
If anyone else, or a comment, what do you think?
Yeah, maybe a question, because the concepts you presented, I think, were all very urban for an urban environment in a city. And I think it's probably much harder to do similar concepts in the countryside, where there isn't as much public transport and as much infrastructure in place. Are there concepts that are more focused on the countryside?
Also, there is, but absolutely agree. I mean, on the countryside, you usually find much higher areas per person, because there are many more single-family houses. You have less infrastructure, not necessarily only public transport, but also what is there for your daily needs. So there are concepts, for example, with multiple use stores. So Mondays there is the dentist, Tuesdays there is the police, Wednesdays there comes the grocer, Thursdays there's the hairdresser, you know, so because it is not necessarily feasible for one person being there all day and all year, but they are sharing different kinds you need for daily use, and this is quite good for the people living there, because they have the possibility to go there. But on the other side, for the people who are doing it, they you know, let's say in a small place with 1,000 inhabitants, you not necessarily need a constant hairdresser. Yeah. So this is one of the concepts we have. We have other concepts there from a project of colleagues of mine from the Öko Institute and Egypt. They were focusing, well, it's not, is it countryside? Maybe not really. It's in Kreis Steinfurt, which is still, you know, very close to Münster, and, you know, rather rich area. But nevertheless, they look very detailed into the group of elderly people living in single-family houses. So there are concepts and research about that too. Yeah.
I have one more question. Initially, you have thought that we have to go in a way that our houses are more efficient and more using less energy, but when we are designing such a house, which is energy plus or whatever, we are using way more energy during construction phase. And in the result, there is no actual gain of energy saving, because you waste more materials, more special materials during construction. How do you deal with this circle in general, so that we still spend the same amount of energy in house, just either operational or embedded?
Yeah, well, that depends very much on which material you choose and how you construct. So there is not such a broad research about the connection resources and energy use for resources in buildings and savings of efficiency measures. But the ones I know is that in the end it is positive. So if you do efficiency measures, if you design highly efficient buildings, in the end, after the end of use of the whole life cycle, it is positive energy-wise. But there are only, to be honest, I know only 2 or 3 studies about it. But also they come to the conclusion that it depends very much on which material you choose. If there is, if you want to gain really higher energy savings after end of use of the building, the whole life cycle, it depends on the material, but yes, there is energy savings.
We talked about this land use,
a very important factor,
Yeah.
but it still needs to be more looked up in a way. And I wanted to ask, I guess this goal of 30 hectares land use per day, this includes not just housing but everything. And also, I guess there's public land and private land, and everything goes there together.
Yeah.
But is there, or do you have some suggestions for public policies in which the development of housing in the cities, and for instance, they get those new developments or developments that are trying to look for these kind of options get prioritized when there is like an opening to build something in public land?
Well, when it comes to housing, a municipality has a couple of options actually, because if they own land or if they want to let land, they can decide which investor they choose. So they have different forms of legislation how to let out the land for investing, and there they have some options how to include not only efficiency but also sufficiency aspects. So they can ask for a specific innovative housing concepts, for example. And it doesn't sound so negatively. It's innovative housing. But in the end, they can, of course, they have, they are using buildings themselves. And I just joined a workshop a couple of months ago where there's a certification for public buildings like schools, kindergartens, offices, etc. And they have a certification of sustainable construction of buildings for public buildings. And they did a workshop, or they are just doing a project, how to include sufficiency into this certification scheme. So they are also thinking about it, but again, there are barriers like regulation, because there's the regulation about you have I don't know, X amount of people working there with different status, and for person X with status Z, it has to be 18 square meters. So it's just the regulation for public buildings. So, and this is, we were thinking and discussing about how which regulation could be adapted to sufficiency aspect, or needs to be adapted, that you at least think about implementing it, like counting home office days, shared spaces, etc., etc. But regulation is not made for that so far.
Yeah, that happens also in cooperative, for instance. They want to build like a shared kitchen, and they realize they cannot then like reduce the square meters for their own kitchen in each flat. So at the end, they have like both things, and they also.
I know another project, Spreefeld in Berlin. They have a very, very big community living thing with 17 people living there, and it is one flat for 17 people, but officially it's 3 flats because they come into this, they're from regarding, I think it's 400 square meters or something. And so you come into a fire protection, etc. So tons of regulation chasing you or forcing you to build it. Yeah.
So one more, then
yeah.
Just jumping into the topic, are there regulations that measures only square meters, or you actually measure the volume? Because you can go 4 meter floors, 4 meter ceilings, and then there is no saving actually, because you waste so much materials.
The problem, well, let's say that it is much easier for now to focus on square meters, because we have much more data for that. So it's much more difficult to find data about heights of flats, or heights of things, or volumes, general data. nevertheless, the question of height is quite important, because if you have, like, let's say 10 square meter room, at the impression, or your personal impression of, is it small or is it big? Is it scary? Depends very much on your on the height. If you have 10 or 20 meters and you have different heights of ceilings, the impression can be, oh, this is very low, the ceiling. It can be, oh, this is quite nice, and you maybe even have the option to include something in the room, area you need. And if the space is very small and the ceiling is very high, your impression is like you're in a prison. So this personal feeling of the relation from height to height is an important aspect, but there is not so much work on that so far.
Okay, so I think we're coming to an end. Anja, that was also a great discussion. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Especially you, Anna, for a great discussion.